So we can get our horse across a creek or something like this, kicking and spanking and spurring, or they can solve a problem. You can let them splash, you can let them put their head down. You may go with your friends out on a trail ride and they may say, well, spur your horse, get him across, let's go. Well, what happens the second time you come around, tomorrow or the next day, right? You've got yourself a problem, much more of a problem than if they can explore and splash maybe and put their head down. They have binocular vision right in front. So oftentimes we're restraining, holding their head up, and all they want to do is get depth perception by putting their head down. And that horse gets across there and you walk back uneventfully the other way, you could cross the rapids the next time. Because your horse asked that question, am I safe? And you provided space and time. You said, yeah, I'm going to let you figure it out. I'm going to give you, and your horse will know. After a while, your horse will be confident. It'll trust that you will give your horse time to sort something out. Because a lot of times, we're in a hurry, and the horse senses we're not going to give it time. And where does it go? Right up into the sympathetic nervous system. And they're not learning, they're reacting at that point. And I remember talking with Martin. He said, you know, it's funny, my granddad used to say things like, never let that horse win. Right? So you got to go back and teach it a lesson. And he said, what I learned was that if we weren't getting somewhere and I wasn't clear enough in my communication, and they're up here in the nervous system, I would just say, you know what? We're reaching diminishing returns. This is just going to get worse and worse and worse. Let's just go do something you know how to do real easy, and then you're up for the night. And he said, I'd get them the next day, and they were just ready to go. But, you know, I had a banshee on my hands if I forced the issue. Tom Dorn said the same sort of thing. You know, if you go and work with a horse for a few months and turn that horse out, you can get that horse 6 months later. And if it's good situations, good learning, even brief moments, your horse will have created dendrites and will be twice as good as they were before you turn them out. I can't quantify that twice as much, but they'll be better. And worse, if you fought them about something or other and you've had bad connections with them and you turn them loose, that's going to stick, and you got to work through that. Can you see whose face that is under the shadows? That's Chrissy. Now she's going to have to let me know if I murder her quote here. But do you want to introduce this little Arab here real quick?
Sure. So this is a little Arab mare we got as a 7-year-old. She had been started, but the only thing they did was get on her back and race her around. So she thought a foot in the stirrup or a rider on her back meant to run. We got her when she was 7. I immediately started clinicking with her, and within 2 months she was able to stand still and relax. Within a year, I could ride her anywhere with anything.
So here's your quote. Because my initial time with her was inadvertently sporadic, and because we only worked on staying calm when I put my foot in the stirrup, the circumstances had conspired to give her a lot of time. With that time, she was allowed to settle from a chronically stressed state to a more relaxed state, which allowed her learning to be more firmly cemented. She could integrate the information and start to have confidence in our interaction. Space and time did miracles, right? That stirrup was no longer a gas pedal, right? Warwick Schiller, a longtime friend of mine, writes, "You have to be present when you're working with a horse. Before, I might have been unwilling to wait and give the horse the time it needed. I wasn't patient enough. The horses felt it, and it would trigger their sympathetic nervous system. Once that happened, I lost the connection." Mark and I were talking about it on the way from the airport over here. Can you think of how many horses of yours have been a problem because you gave them too much time to assimilate information? When did that really cause a big problem with your horse? It's gold. So here's our toggle switch. Nucleus accumbens, curiosity, we want, trying to avoid fear. Locus ceruleus, Latin for blue area. That's a little pot of norepinephrine, what we think of as adrenaline. Right? So you could keep pressuring your horse, and sometimes they'll just stay still, and you'll think they're tolerating something, and the whole time you're getting a spurt, and a spurt, and a spurt of adrenaline. And then eventually, well, out of nowhere, I don't know where that came from, right? Because we put on pressure, and the amygdala is talking to us, but we're not listening, and we're pumping gas onto the whole situation. What we want to do is help our horses find a safe zone. We want to help them to down-regulate. So, people say, well, that's desensitization. So let's say that's what we're going to use, desensitization. We're going to get this person to walk down to the end of the pier. They're afraid of water. And we're going to desensitize them so they tune everything out. Right? They just walk down there. Well, eventually what's going to happen is they're going to get down here and the wave's going to splash over their leg. They're going to go, holy crap, right? And they're going to come apart, right? Because we don't want to tune out. We don't want to tune out. What we want is our horses to be aware of everything, but not reacting. We want to create awareness, and we do that by setting up situations where they're curious, raising that bar, and providing serotonin, which is helps with emotional balance. I like this quote by Albert Einstein, "I never teach my pupils, I only provide the conditions in which they can learn." That's what we want to do with our horse. Emotional regulation versus hyperarousal, right? We want them to feel comfortable. We want them to feel safe versus hyper alert. When they're hyper alert, you can even get paranoid. You know yourself, you start to see threats that aren't even there. So you want them to feel safe. You need attention, so you need them to be focused versus distracted. So it's hard to teach them if, their buddies over the fence over there they want to look at, and, a piece of cellophane blows across them. And they got to check that out. But we need their attention. Curiosity versus disengagement. If they're not engaged, then we're going to have trouble learning. This is true of humans as well. We want to support versus punish. There's very few instances where, what are we really accomplishing by punishing? By punishing. And you can have negative reinforcement, or you can add pressure and take pressure away. But pure punishment to a horse that doesn't have a frontal lobe, in my book, that's cruel. We're asking them to do something they can't do, and then we're labeling that, and then on top of that, we're punishing that. And small bits of information. Small bits of information over space and time. Overnight, we learn better. I'll show you this thing called long-term potentiation, how we lock in our memories and how we lock in our information. ARAS, Ascending Reticular Activating System. You don't have to know that. RAS, what is it? It's radar. Horses are motor sensory creatures. It's their radar. It's got input coming through the vestibular system, cranial nerve number 8. That's acoustic. In vestibular, it's a shared nerve. Our friend the trigeminal nerve is sending in optic nerve, olfactory bulb. So the horse is getting all this information. And we're somewhere in there when we're trying to teach them. So what we have to do is they have to attend to, oh, that's a bag over there. Oh, that's my friends over there. And we can't get anywhere unless we can bring their attention back to us. So constantly in a learning situation, not in a mean way, but we have to just keep pulling their attention back to us because they don't have the frontal lobe that can really stay with their relaxed alertness. So a good portion of what we do is maintaining that connection. This is a friend of mine, Wes Taylor. He works only with Mustangs. And so he says, that's the part I really need. I have to down-regulate so that they're emotionally regulated and get their attention. So I think he's going to get somewhere with this horse. Buster McClory, a trainer who's looking for the same kinds of things, that relaxed alertness. Because I should have sent this picture to the French woman who keeps sending me these emails. How ready are these horses to work? If I come and I stand right here and say, let's go to work. Okay, everybody. Their heads are down. They're in the parasympathetic nervous. This one's hip shot back here, resting on its hoof. I'm not getting anywhere. If the pressure's too high, they can't focus either. So we need that right emotional balance. We need curiosity working for us. I can mess up everything by kicking that ball, but look at that horse is there checking this thing out. They get brave. They get real confident if you can do that. And if you keep giving them problems, pretty soon they want to search out everything. Show me the rest of the world. Horses have what's called a false positive bias. This is what I talked about earlier when I said everything is considered a predatory threat unless proven otherwise. So if I'm out here eating grass, if it's a false positive, maybe this turns out to be a kid in a Halloween suit. Maybe this turns out to be a poodle. Maybe it's just a big ball of fluff, right? But I'm not going to live long if I'm sitting there, well, let's just wait and see how this plays out, right? I'm designed to get out of dodge. And we call horses stupid for that, but they're actually doing perfectly what they're designed to do. A false negative bias, right, would be, well, that's probably not a lion. Chances are it's not a lion. That may be the neighbor kid goofing around over there. They're eating, right? So having this built-in bias that things are threatening, right? So their reticular activating system is saying, hold on, this is a threat. And that's what we need to do. That's what I mean by making a horse aware that they're safe. They're asking that question. The reticular activating system said, wait, this is a threat. We're going to say, okay, you want to check this out? Want to go over there and have a look? I'll go with you, right? Wait for that licking and chewing. Don't go over there and say, I showed it to them, so they should know. Go over there and stand over there. And at first, they don't want to do anything. And then pretty soon, maybe I'll check this out. And then pretty soon, maybe the head comes down a little bit and they start to, man, that's gold. They've reset their nervous system. They can take a bigger threat next time around, right? They've learned to find that internal place of security because you gave them time to do that. You can just really mess that up by rush and say, I gave you time. You don't know that you gave them time. They'll tell you in your conversation. This looks like an almond. That's because it's an almond. But the almond, the amygdala is shaped like an almond. And that's Latin for almond because early anatomists found that the amygdala looked like an almond. So I know a number of people were here last night when we talked about dementias involving the hippocampus. That's the area that's diseased in Alzheimer's disease because this is a memory center. Interesting enough, the amygdala sits right on the hippocampus. That makes sense if you're building a brain because emotional memories will carry the most weight. They've actually done experiments where they cut the amygdala off on monkeys, and then monkeys would handle snakes. They were worst enemies. You know, they're so afraid of them, but they weren't afraid. There was a woman that they didn't realize that she had damage to the amygdala on one side. She had seizures that they could determine were on the other side of the brain, and they were in the temporal lobe. So they did a temporal lobectomy. They took the temporal lobe out on the woman and took out her amygdala. Now she's left with no amygdala, so no fear. So she walked across a park and was mugged at night, and the next night her friends couldn't believe she walked through the same park. And she said, well, what are the chances are going to happen again? So in the same respect, we don't want to awaken that sleeping amygdala too much, because fear is related to the amygdala. It's the alarm system. It's the sentinel. It's the security system for the horse's brain. What we want to do is we want to take the high road. So, the message comes in. It's sensed by the reticular activating system, sensory. It goes to the thalamus, where we want it to go. That's where it needs to go. And the thalamus sends it out, and we get a motor response. That's the high road. Works like it's supposed to. The low road, which is very sensitive, though, goes to the thalamus, and then over here to the amygdala. And when it goes there, the amygdala rings the alarm. So we get emotional behavior, we get these autonomic responses where they go way up in the sympathetic nervous system, hormonal responses where we get cortisol and all kinds of stress. So that's that toggle switch back and forth. If we keep it on the amygdala, we can create problems. And this is what the brain says. Something's wrong. Commence the panic sequence. Now, we're humans, so we have this huge frontal lobe. So we could get caught in a situation where our neurochemistry has us frightened, but we can think through options, or has us confused or upset. We can say, well, my friend did this, and you know what, maybe I could try this, or here's something that worked, in the past, or I read something about this, right? The horse, they get trapped they're victims of their emotional state. And the only way they know to get out of that, if we don't show them how to down-regulate, right, is to go fight or flight. And then we blame them for that. But that's a perfect design to get the heck out of Dodge. Here it is just once again. The thalamus, somatosensory motor cortex, we're trying not to send it this way, to the amygdala. I hope Mark doesn't mind my mentioning this. He's working on a movie script, and so he asked me about some emotional reactions, some traumas that humans may have. The amygdala is involved in PTSD. It's hooked to the hippocampus. If you think you're going to die, if you are in a terribly frightening situation, women who are raped, the amygdala will charge so hard that it creates a super memory. You can't get rid of it, even if you want to. In any situation that slightly resembles that situation will bring up the same feelings again. Those are flashbacks. So the Vietnam vet who's walking in the sand on the beach, and the palm fronds are blowing in the wind, and the news helicopter comes over. They're not feeling like they're back at war. They actually feel they are in Vietnam again. Almost debilitating fear. So you can get horses like that. You won't even know, and I'm sure maybe even here, you won't even know what their history is. And they'll have traumas that something will recreate that situation, and it's such a quick. That low road happens fast with a little bit of information. All they need is it to seem similar to a past trauma. Bingo. And it's fast. The high road information moves more slowly, so it's good for survival. But what we want to do is not create those, because you won't know where they came from, and they're hard to get rid of. You have to really work with your horse. You need like 100 good situations to override that one bad before they'll go back to trusting. Number 9, glossopharyngeal. Stimulates the flow of saliva. We could talk a little bit about the vagus nerve, number 10, because there's this thing, polyvagal theory that you may have heard about. And basically, they say, wait, there's one step more. There's fight, flight, or freeze. We're not sure if when you lay a horse down, we're not creating that freeze. We're not sure if it's good or bad. We know the horse is different when they come back up. And so we assume it's good, but I don't know that we necessarily know that, because there's this thing called quiescence that's a life threat kind of switch that you can stimulate, and it's designed. You know, the animal gets knocked down like a zebra, and the lions are tearing it up and start to tear into its insides, and then you watch that animal stop struggling. And we know also that they get tremendous amounts of opioids internal. So it's almost like nature saying, you're dead, but we're going to have mercy on you, and we're going to let you fill with these opioids that will at least not let you feel that excruciating pain as your insides are eaten out, right? So maybe it's those opioids that we see when that horse lets us do 1,001 things when they're down on the ground, right, that's happening. We don't know what that event actually did. So, I mean, we use it, and I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying be very aware that we're dealing with a brain and we're just starting to figure it out. And just because something looks good doesn't mean it's necessarily in the best interest or welfare of our horse. So this is this polyvagal, and it pretty much follows what we know, except for life threat, death feigning, shutdown, immobilization is another branch from fight or flight. And you've probably felt something like that where you get so panicked you paralyze. You just can't make a decision whatsoever. You know, it's not fight or flight. We talked about this. The hypothalamus releases, and we'll look at this, we'll dissect this out too. The hypothalamus sends information to the pituitary gland, it sends information to the adrenal cortex that shoots off cortisol. Jim had asked me last night about cortisol. Can you measure it? It's easy to measure. You can measure it in the blood, you can measure it in saliva. An interesting study that they did with the measurement of cortisol, maybe you've heard of this, is they took some novice riders, some beginner riders, and some what they would thought were expert riders. And they said, you're going to go inside this barn, and we're going to come at you with a big golf umbrella, opening and closing it. And you just have to be ready. You and your horse have to be ready to handle this situation. And they took heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol readings. And they sent the first rider in, and they did nothing. And then they sent the rider out the other side of the barn. And they looked at the cortisol levels, the heart rate, the blood pressure. Right? Those beginning riders, their cortisol levels were high, and when they went into the barn, the horse's cortisol levels and heart rate went up when they came out the other side. The expert riders kind of stayed stable. The horses were, they had no idea this was an experiment. Horses went in, they were fine inside the barn, nothing happened, and they were fine out. That just tells you how finely tuned your horse is to your own stress and anxiety. You know, they're reading that. So, you know, sometimes it's getting a handle on your own stress and fear. And ignoring that actually is bad for both of you. And people say, well, get out there, do that, do this. Sometimes you almost have to come to terms with that this is a problem, and my horse is going to read it as a problem, and we have to have this communication back and forth so that we can trust one another. How do clever Hans read messages? Yeah, he sensed them. Man had a horse, clever Hans, and he claimed that Hans could do math problems, addition. So he would ask a math problem, and then clever Hans with his hoof would click out the answer, and clever Hans got it almost every time. Amazing. The newspapers came, other scientists came to study this. They said, well, what if we had somebody else do it? So somebody else asked the question, and it took a while, but clever Hans started to get the answers. Wow, clever Hans is really bright, a mathematician. Then they asked clever Hans the question, and then they had to hide behind a screen. Clever Hans couldn't figure it out. What they found out was that clever Hans, and the owner did not purposely do this, but clever Hans was reading the body language. And when they got the right answer, either a change in breath, or they dipped their head, or whatever happened, clever Hans was reading that response and would stop counting at the point that he saw the change take place. So they were called scandalous and a big fraud, and everybody said, you're terrible, and it hit the newspapers. But what everybody lost sight of is how amazing that was, that here's this horse that can read those messages. So do we really need spurs that dig in deep? I mean, do we really have to whack on a horse that's that sensitive to messages? No, we just have to make our messages on the same level. We don't want to force the horse to come up to our level where we have to provide that much punishment or stimulation. We want to come up to the horse's level where we get sensitive enough in our communication. And that is so rewarding to realize they're reading me. They're reading everything that I'm doing. I just have to put it in the right language. And when you do that, it really is an amazing feeling. And I see a lot of people shaking their head that you get your horse you're in harmony. Just the impact of stress hormones, chronic stress, sends the blood sugar glucose levels, just like in humans, blood pressure goes up. It's just not good stuff. Because here's why. We can create dendrites. We can create this big forest, right? If we keep our horses emotionally regulated, and we can show them how to solve problems. You can stress them, and what do? You trim those branches off. You actually can shrink your horse's brain by getting after them all the time, by learned helplessness. I answered that question. Why do they keep asking it? I don't know. I'm confused. I'm up here in the high level of my nervous system all the time. Well, if we're creating that much cortisol and that much stress all the time, that's what we're going to do. We're going to shrink our forest down. We're going to get horses that will never live up to their potential, that will feel I'm trying the best I can, and we shut the door on them. This is kind of interesting, is that it's not a complete shutdown. This is in a relaxed situation. Here's a control subject in a relaxed situation. Not much brain activity. This is supposedly a relaxed situation. And look at this PTSD brain. It's all hyper aroused. So, you can see those horses. They'll dissociate. That's what they'll do. They'll check out, under pressure. And you'll think that they're okay, but they're somewhere else. And then the problem is when they finally wake up and they find that they're in a situation they don't know how to handle, right? Because they've checked out. We don't want to desensitize them to block out the world, right? Everything that I see, I'm aware of. I don't have to react to this. I don't have to react to that. I'm okay with this. And if I'm not, I'm going to be given space and time to figure it out. And we're going to go, and I'm curious actually to see what that is. It's amazing. Once you start to build these dendrites and build this curiosity in your horse, you'll be amazed. How did they get so smart? You set up the environment to allow them to do that. So this looks idyllic to some people, not to that guy. Right? Glutamate. Do we want to talk about glutamate? We should. Glutamate glues the pathways. So, dopamine, we search for a pathway. Neurons that fire together will get wired together. How do they get wired together? Well, we have serotonin, and serotonin will start through reflection to make new dendrites. Glutamate will go and glue them all together and make them permanent. I'll show you how that happens. All right? This is a scary looking slide. It's really not. LTP is what happens in us, long-term potentiation. All learning and memory is based on long-term potentiation. You need space and time for this to happen. Here's how it happens. You're introduced to something. It's the first time you've read a subject. You take a new class, and you've read the first chapter or two. Then you put the book aside, and you don't get back to it for a couple of days. Glutamate forms, these are synapses between neurons, and glutamate will float in this gap. And here's two receptors, an AMPA receptor and an NMDA receptor. This is open. So once glutamate sits in here, sodium can creep in to the neuron, and it fires. Weekly, we get a memory trace. Okay? This orange thing is magnesium. It's a block, like a castle. So we get glutamate, but this is not going to open for us. The next day we study. We read a book. Hey, I learned about that somewhere in class. You go to a lecture. Pretty soon, you're learning more and more. You're building the scaffolding. So what's happening is more and more glutamate is following that same channel. And pretty soon, you'll get what's called electrostatic repulsion. That's not the creepy feeling you get from somebody who's creepy sitting next to you, right? Electrostatic repulsion is blowing that magnesium plug out of there, which I'm hoping will happen for you guys, and calcium comes in, a second messenger. Once calcium comes in, dendrites grow like crazy. That's why you can't cram for a test, because you're doing this. And after you take that test, you've forgotten 3/4 of what you learned. But if you become an expert at something, you're going over here. If our horse gets comfortable in more and more situations, and we're developing curiosity, we're creating more long-term potentiation. Horses don't like what's unpredictable, right? They like to know what the world's all about, so it's less threatening, right? The more long-term potentiation we can create, the more tools they feel they have to handle their whole world. And the same with you. You may, let's say you came to this for the first time. You've never heard of neurochemistry. What are all these terms this guy keeps rattling on about? Don't be afraid. This is where you're at right now. You don't have a scaffolding yet in place to hang that information on. But you're starting to build one. And some of you have bigger scaffolding, so you know what to pay attention to and not what to pay attention to. That fits with what I heard. This is a piece of the puzzle that comes together. As that puzzle comes together, the more you bring that together, the more you create long-term potentiation. The more dendrites you have. We know this. There's all those dendrites. All right, we're going to fly. Myelin. We're going to dissect the brain. We're going to look at white matter in the brain. When we talked about dementia last night, I showed you white matter in the brain. That white matter is myelin. Myelin is a fatty insulation. It wraps around a neuron. It's insulation. It allows that neuron to fire very, very quickly. Fast movement of information. That's an electron microscopic picture of myelin around nerves. So that's what it looks like. All right, I heard all the clicks. We're good. So this is a horse brain that's been stained. See all this white matter? That's our information pathways. That's all myelin. So, horses, when they're born, they myelinate differently than we do. Their motor system, their motor sensory, their motor system myelinates fast. In the first 45 days, faster than you can imagine. That makes sense for their survival. They got to be on their feet. They got to be moving pretty quickly. If you've ever watched young foals, they're fun to watch because their cerebellum and the myelin is in their motor systems all working together. So these weird jumps in the air and these crazy stretches, they just seem so odd, these positions they get themselves in, but they're firing neurons while they're doing that. And more they hone them down until they get more and more precise. And so it doesn't take long before they're moving right in step with mama. But bear in mind, the very last place for myelination in the horse is the frontal lobe. So if we're demanding a 2-year-old pay attention to us all day long, if we're drilling them, they don't have the myelin there. They can't hold it even if they wanted to. Those 1 or 2 freaks that have been able to do it, oftentimes they burn out too in these futurities, and they're no good after, they've competed for a small amount of time. But what you don't see is the bottom of that pyramid with all those horses that have been wasted by what we've done to them.